directly vented through an open window, so there was a constant problem with dust and smoke and soot on the interiors of homes. The introduction of the fireplace, in which the smoke is vented directly upwards through a chimney, meant that the interiors of homes could be kept much cleaner. Because of this, because you didn't have this constant problem with soot and dust on the interiors, meant that people could start thinking about decorating the interiors of their rooms, painting them and decorating them in other ways, such as fresco paintings on the walls.
Tuscan palaces and houses had windows closed by wooden shutters or, at times, oiled parchment that would admit some light. In the 1300s, glass windows became increasingly popular. They were expensive and made a statement about the wealth of the owner of the house.
From 1306, we have a record that states that the urban palace of the Conte Guidi family of Florence was popularly known as the Palace of Mirrors because of the presence of glass in all of the windows. It gave a mirrored-like surface to the exterior of the house. After the great flood in Florence in 1333, a local preacher told his congregation that this terrible deluge was a punishment from God for, among other things, the luxury of glass windows.
This is the Sienese palace of the Ptolemy banking family, built around 1270. It was the height of style and one of the most costly private dwellings in 13th century Siena.
The Sienese palace of the Ptolemy banking family consists of 3 stories, a very high lower level, which was used for business and for storage, and 2 upper floors, which were used as the residential apartments of the family. Because of the constant strife between the families of Siena, it was deemed prudent to build an urban palace that was defensible against attack. These precautions were not entirely successful, however, because in 1322, a group of intruders from the rival Salimbeni family got into the upper level of the palace by a ladder and murdered 3 young Ptolemy boys.
Rampant spending also fueled a building boom in country houses. In about 1338, Giovanni Villani noted in his Chronicle of Florentine Life that there was no citizen who had not built or was not building a large and rich estate in the countryside, with an expensive mansion and other buildings even better than those in the city. Each one of them was sinning in this respect, and they were considered mad for their inordinate expenditure. It was such a marvelous thing to see. Along with houses, clothes, and jewels, the newly wealthy were also anxious to acquire status. They spent a considerable amount of their accumulating cash on their public image. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the merchant class was a new social force looking to establish its place in a society led by the church and the nobility. The merchant banker's identity was inextricably linked with his city. He committed his money, his time, and his organizational abilities to seeing his city grow, prosper, and demonstrate its wealth in beautiful buildings. The best painting, and sculpture, and public spaces in which to see and be seen. The city was as defining for the merchant class as cathedrals and abbeys were for the church, and as castles and estates for the nobility. The beauty of the city not only enhanced the city's reputation, it enhanced the individual reputation of its citizens. To be Sienese or Florentine implied wealth and status. No matter how far a merchant banker traveled or how long he was away, his connection to his city was deep and lifelong. His contribution to public buildings, road improvements, fountains, and other civic projects was an investment in his own reputation, as well as a service to his fellow citizens. Giovanni Villani paints a vivid picture of his city. Its citizens are well-bred, and its women lovely and adorned. Its buildings are beautiful and filled with many useful crafts. For these reasons, many people from distant lands come to see Florence, not because they have to, but because of its crafts and guilds and the beauty and decoration of the city. This can still be said of Florence. Money invested in the beauty of the city in the 13th and 14th centuries continues to benefit Florentines today. The Sienese, not to be outdone, also invested in the beauty of their city. Among the most important public sculptures in Siena are these: the she-wolf, suckling the twins Romulus and Remus, an image usually associated with ancient Rome. On city gates, and paintings. In public squares, this she-wolf proclaims an ancient heritage for the city. Works of art were funded by the new middle class to enhance their image and that of their city. The she-wolf promotes the legend that Siena's origins lie with Senius and Ascius, the sons of Remus, twin brother of Romulus, the founder of Rome. By claiming this legendary beginning, the Sienese merchant class acquired a lineage as long as the nobility and longer than the church. But no matter how much money you had, how ancient your heritage, how rich your possessions, how vast your properties, how beautiful your city, urban life in the 13th and 14th centuries confronted you daily with people much less fortunate. Cities like Siena and Florence were growing rapidly because of trade and manufacturing. Textiles had become a major industry. Thousands came from the country to the city to turn raw wool into the finest cloth in Europe. These new arrivals also formed a new class, the urban poor. Today, municipal governments provide essential services such as schools, orphanages, hospitals, and cemeteries. In the 13th and 14th centuries, this was not the case. Cities were inventing themselves. The rights and responsibilities of cities, provinces, the church, the nobility, and the newly wealthy merchant families were being defined and tested. It was clear that for cities to function well, charity was essential. The poor, the sick, the dying, the old, and the destitute needed help, and new religious institutions sprang up to fill this need.
I think one disadvantage that we as modern people have is we tend to think of the church as a separate institution. And even when we talk about the separation of church and state, we imagine that there's the church on one hand, there's the state on the other, and somehow we aren't even in that equation. These are two institutions that may have some kind of relation to them, and we're not really there. A medieval person or a Renaissance person would have found that absolutely impossible to understand. They saw religion as something which had to be lived out in the most immediate way, as something which wasn't something that the priests did, but something that ordinary people had to do. And confraternities arise as a way to express that. The confraternities were gatherings, brotherhoods. They could be a few dozen people. They could be a few hundred people. They would gather together as a self-selecting group. So nobody was forced into a confraternity, and nobody could really barge into a confraternity. It was the group of people in there who decided who they wanted to have as part of their group. So the idea there is that they were choosing their family. They referred to each other as brothers and sisters. So we sometimes talk of them as being kinship organizations, because kinship was what really brought them together. And they saw each other as kin. One of the things kin do is help each other.
And the most tangible form of help was money. In a time and place when Christian belief was universal, helping the poor and doing unto others as you would have them do unto you was fundamentally important. Wealthy citizens felt a moral responsibility to assist those less fortunate. Spending money on charity was a way to please God and find your way into heaven. As well as contributing their money and time to confraternities, the middle class also supported new religious orders, such as the Franciscans, whose charitable work focused on the urban poor. Charitable organizations established in the 12 and 1300s by the new rich of Florence and Siena still exist as essential social services in Italy today.
We are in the institutional headquarters of what today would be called a philanthropic organization. What in the Middle Ages was a confraternity, a brotherhood, devoted to acts of Christian charity. In this case, its official name is the Fraternitas Misericordiae, the Confraternity of Mercy. In Florence today, they still call it the Misericordia. They were founded in the mid-1200s. They moved into these handsome premises in the early 1300s. They then enlarged them, and in the beginning of the 1340s, they called a painter, probably an assistant of Bernardo Daddi, one of the great Florentine masters of the age, to create an emblematic image, to create a kind of symbolic image. It is, in a way, an allegory, but a very easy one to read and extremely eloquent of the sense of their life together. The way the 14th century thought was strongly in terms of allegory. Here, though, what we see in the fresco is an enormous woman, a woman who is a figure of mercy and who probably also stands for the Virgin Mary, seen as the embodiment of God's mercy. What's strange is that she is robed as if she were a priest, indeed a bishop. She has headgear that we would associate with that of a bishop, with a bishop's mitre. It's not as if she's an early instance of the ordination, indeed episcopal consecration of women. That didn't exist in the church in the Middle Ages, and in the Catholic Church does not exist today. But it is Mary dressed as a figure of ministry, episcopal and even sacerdotal. And she wears a great mantle, which is properly called a cope, and on the cope, the embroidered circles in the border actually depict the acts of mercy, the acts of corporal mercy, as they're called, feeding the sick, giving drink to the thirsty, housing the homeless, visiting prisoners, looking after the sick, burying the dead, and so on, that the members of the confraternity engaged in. So she's very much the embodiment of what they do. To her right and left, you have the members of the confraternity. You have men and women, richly clothed, because these are well-to-do people. They're people mainly of the merchant and banker class, who contribute part of their wealth, who contribute their time and energy to the range of charitable activities which the confraternity engages in.
Misericordia means mercy in Italian. And confraternities of the Misericordia were confraternities that were aimed to exercise mercy, to practice charity. And the Misericordia in particular picked out two things that it was going to do. One was, and these were lay people again, laymen of the confraternity who offered the charity. One thing they did was help children. And the Misericordia had a service, let's put it that way, but whereby they would take in children who'd been abandoned by their parents and would try to match these up with other foster parents. So in a very immediate way, they were looking to the needs of the most vulnerable group in society, of children. The other group they looked out for, and the group which in a sense they became more well known for, was the sick and the dying. And in Tuscany, in Florence in particular, the Misericordia became the ambulance service.
Here in Florence and today all through Italy, the network of mercy confraternities, of which this is the oldest, founded probably in 1244, really provides adequate, low-cost paramedical help to such an extent that when people, at least in Tuscany, want an ambulance, they don't say call the ambulance, they say call the Misericordia.
The religious affiliations of hospitals and children's charities in cities throughout Europe and North America can be traced back to these 13th century origins. In Italy, the Misericordia and its members have provided continuous service to the community for more than 750 years. Charitable organizations, working for wages, earning, borrowing, lending and spending money, credit and interest, paper, Arabic numerals, eyeglasses and entrepreneurs are all things we recognize. The world that commerce, money and charity start to shape in the 13th and 14th centuries begins to look much like the world today. And like today, cities were the place to be. At the dawn of the Renaissance, money proved the catalyst for many revolutionary changes. The development of cities is among the most significant. Money could pay for the bricks and mortar, but it would take new innovations, new forms of government, and new approaches to living with each other to make the new cities work.